Welcome back, friends. Welcome back to the Corbett Report. I'm your host, James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, and you are tuned into Questions for Corbett, that regular series where usually you bring in the questions and I bring the answers, but actually that's not how it's going to work this time. You know when you go to a party and a couple of people are talking and someone asks someone a question and someone overhears that question and steps in to answer it themselves? Well, I'm going to be that guy today because today's question for Corbett is not really a question for Corbett per se. It's more of a rhetorical question asked to the digital ether, but I will take it upon myself to answer it because I think it is an intriguing question with an even more intriguing answer that points to some interesting possibilities. What am I talking about? I am talking very specifically about an article posted up by that Gestalt entity known as Tyler Durden at zerohedge.com, but we'll take this from the Activist Post repost because activistpost.com deserves your love and attention. And they posted this up a couple of weeks ago. Cashless Society, WEF, boasts that 98% of central banks are adopting CBDCs. But perhaps this question isn't going in the direction that you think it is. The rhetorical question that opens this article is as follows. Whatever happened to the WEF, the World Economic Forum? 1 minute they were everywhere in the media, and now they have all but disappeared from public discourse. After the pandemic agenda was defeated and the plan to exploit public fear to create a perpetual medical autocracy was exposed, Klaus Schwab and his merry band of globalists slithered back into the woodwork. To be sure, we'll be seeing them again one day, but for now, the WEF has relegated itself away from the spotlight and into the dark recesses of the Davos echo chamber. So that is the question that is on the plate for today. Whatever happened to the WEF? And I think the framing of this question, the fact that it is being at least articulated, is interesting for a number of reasons. But let's set the table, make sure we're all on the same page here, because if you are like me, then you will be able to cast your mind back to those heady days of the early days of the scamdemic back in 2020, when it seemed all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Klaus Schwab and the Great Reset and the World Economic Forum were on everyone's lips.
Who is Klaus Schwab? What does he want? What goes on at the World Economic Forum, and should we be afraid of their evil, malicious agenda?
Here's Klaus Schwab. I know you guys like Klaus Schwab. You know Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum, who's right out of like Hollywood 101, the evil guy. He seemingly is running half of the world right now.
So mastering the future is now the top item on the to-do list at the World Economic Forum this year. That's the first clue these people are not living the same life you are. By the end of this week, you hope to find some time to get an oil change or maybe pick up some dandruff shampoo at Rite Aid. At the World Economic Forum, they plan to master the future. That's the kind of people they are.
The head of the WEF, real-life Bond villain and founder of the WEF, Klaus Schwab, has decided that we have to get used to a total erosion of privacy.
Yes, as I say, if you have been around in the independent media space over the past few years, you will definitely have seen this phenomenon. The fact that in 2020, 2021, maybe even into 2022, the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab were names to conjure by. Simply putting World Economic Forum in a headline, in an article, suddenly would get it much more attention than it would otherwise have had. And as we have just witnessed, I'm sure you saw it yourself too, a lot of formerly mainstream personalities, hosts of mainstream TV network anchor news programs and Hollywood productions, etc., who had spent years deriding and denigrating those crazy conspiracy theorists who talked about such things as 9/11, were suddenly, well, wow, that seems that there's a conspiracy happening, and it's the World Economic Forum, I tell ya. So it was an interesting time and an interesting thing to witness, but equally interesting is what this Tyler Durden article is pointing to. Well, whatever happened to the WF? They were all over the place, and suddenly they've slunk off into the corner and they're not to be seen anymore. No, that is not quite what happened. What has happened is the focus of attention has turned. And suddenly, when you turn your focus of attention, that thing over there is still there. It's still doing its thing. It's just that people aren't paying attention to it. So it's as if it doesn't exist. If a WEF falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Maybe the Zen Buddhist way of framing this question. And it is an important question because this was something that I specifically was at pains to warn against at the time that it was happening, because I recognized this phenomenon for what it was as it was happening, as I started to see people falling off the turnip truck and just suddenly discovering conspiracy reality, and all congregating and gravitating towards the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and the Great Reset as the focus of attention and energy. I noticed that this was happening and that this was a potential danger because, as I pointed out again and again, in fact, almost every time that I've referenced Klaus Schwab in the past few years, you will notice that I'm always referencing him as a carnival barker who's just barking people into the World Economic Forum tent. But what the World Economic Forum is, what it represents, is nothing other than a rebranding attempt on a very old idea that has been forwarded by many, many New World Order minions and gophers over the years. Namely, the New World Order. That's what the Great Reset is. It's just a new way of packaging it. The Fourth Industrial Revolution is just technocracy and transhumanism rewarmed and served in a different dish, and as if that's going to make a difference to what it is. But it isn't. It's just a rebranding attempt, and for what it's worth, Klaus Schwab was remarkably successful in the past few years of gaining people's attention and successfully rebranding as if he came up with any of this stuff, when of course he did not. And I think we run the risk of losing sight of the fact that this is about ideas and an ideology more so than it is about this particular organization, which in the big, vast scheme of things doesn't matter. It's not important. The World Economic Forum is not the controlling structure, power structure for the oligarchy. Now, again, as I say, I have talked about this over and over and over throughout the years, perhaps most notably in a previous edition of Questions for Corbett, where I was answering a creatively worded question from a viewer named Richard, who was writing about the World Economic Forum and Bilderberg and how these sorts of organizations get raised and talked about and then sort of discarded, and people don't think about them anymore. I was addressing this point quite specifically a couple of years ago. Now, I think there are grand unifying narratives that you could construct about the nature of oligarchical power and how power operates in society and how people decide to band together, even across different lines and across interest at times in order to preserve their power. And we can look at examples of how that works that has been documented and is relatively uncontroversial. You can look at the way the mafia works. And yes, not every mafia don is necessarily together with every other one, but there are times when they will come together to defend the system. And that's one way that we can get a handle on the grander theory of what's happening here. But it doesn't mean that everything reduces down to the one thing that we can find that then becomes a trend that will trend for a while, and then people will jump onto the next bandwagon. So World Economic Forum is the bandwagon of the moment. That does not mean that it is not significant in any way. Of course, I do think Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and what they represent and the types of ideas that are being forwarded through that vehicle at this moment are significant, but it's more the ideas that are being forwarded that are significant, more so than the relation to the World Economic Forum, which I have pointed out numerous times over the past couple of years, is attempting to essentially rebrand a very, very old idea. The New World Order isn't really a new idea at all, and all of the aspects of that are now just being rebranded and laundered through the WEF into this Great Reset agenda. And every time people talk about the Great Reset and focus on Klaus Schwab and Davos and the World Economic Forum, they are giving that organization the energy, the exactly what they're looking for. They want the attention in all of this. Klaus Schwab wants to be the new fill in the blank, Kissinger or whoever, right? The person who has such gravitas and importance, because now everyone's talking about the World Economic Forum and talking about the Great Reset. Hey, as a rebranding effort, it was incredibly successful, wasn't it? But the underlying ideology of it is not exclusive to the World Economic Forum. It is not fundamentally about the World Economic Forum. It is about an ideology that is consistent amongst many different groups and many different players in this New World Order system that is being constructed. And right now it's being called the Great Reset, but that is just, we have to differentiate the underlying ideas from the current vehicle. Because the real risk is that we tie everything to the current vehicle which is carrying this ideology, and then at the convenient time, the powers that shouldn't be will scuttle that vehicle. Oh, well, World Economic Forum, who cares, whatever. And they'll move into a different vehicle and carry it further down the field. Exactly as you might say, as seems to have happened with, say, Bilderberg. I remember when I first started getting into this, it was all about Bilderberg and the Bilderberg meeting and trying to get to Bilderberg and what are Bilderberg talking about. And I'm not saying that that wasn't important, but I am saying, well, who even talks about Bilderberg anymore? As I say, there are probably new people who have only come into this in the past couple of years who don't even remember Bilderberg. Who are Bilderberg? I've heard of them. I don't really know what they're about. All I know is World Economic Forum, because they've just shifted into a new vehicle and carrying that football further down the field. Now that is the potential danger here. I trust that you understand my bigger point here. No, the agenda didn't start with the World Economic Forum, and it will not end with the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum is still doing its World Economic Forum thing over in its World Economic Forum corner there in Davos, but that, because we are not paying attention to it, it's like it doesn't exist. People over the years, the very same webmasters and article writers who realized, hey, if I just put World Economic Forum and put some tangential link to Davos into this article, it'll get a lot more views, realized people got sick of it. They moved on to the next thing. They're not clicking as much on Davos, so they don't write about it as much anymore. So it doesn't exist, guys. It is a funny, almost, we can laugh at children or infants for not understanding object permanence. You put the ball out of their sight and they forget that it exists, and you bring it back and it's like a magic trick. Wow, the ball exists again. It's the exact same thing, except the adult version. The World Economic Forum, guys, let's put it over here for a while, and you can bring it out when as needed. Now, there are a number of points to make about this, one of which, as I say, is that it is important not to fixate and focus on Klaus Schwab as if he is some sort of all-powerful person, because quite clearly he isn't. And he doesn't dictate what's happening in the world. He doesn't really have any power whatsoever other than the power that he is given by other people giving their time and attention and energy and money to the World Economic Forum, and the World Economic Forum as a central player in this global conspiracy. But it is not a central player, it is not important, and it will be shuffled out of the deck as needed to distract people away from the underlying agenda, which is the real point. Now, there's an even deeper philosophical point to be made here that is extremely important, not because it allows us to better dwell or fixate on what is wrong with the world and the way that we, oh, poor us, we're being victimized, but because it represents a potential tool in our tool belt for us to use to reposition ourselves and to make the world a better place. So let's dwell on this for a moment, because as I say, when everybody's thinking about and talking about and writing about the World Economic Forum, suddenly it's this big thing. It is news in and of itself. But once people get sick of it and they turn their attention to other things, suddenly, well, the World Economic Forum doesn't exist. Whatever happened to that thing anyway? Do you understand what's happening here? The news about what's happening, what the latest pronouncement of Klaus Schwab or what's happening at Davos is not an objective thing that is written in the stars. It is constructed. It is a narrative. And I hope this will have some resonance to people who saw my recent presentation on how to save the world, because I think this goes right back to that fundamental point that it is narrative. And if the idea of news as narrative seems to ring a bell, haven't I heard something? Oh, right. The news is a social construct. It is used to program you. One of the booby traps that's implanted in our language is the term, the news. As if there is one set of events that we can all universally agree upon are the set of events, the news, that took place today that everyone must talk about. Think about what that implies. Who gets to choose what is the news? And why do we insist on everyone that we consider to be in the news sphere to talk about the same set of events. I bring this up because it strikes me that in the event of any major the news type of event, people are always seeking my comment, my take on it, and that's understandable. I get why that happens, but I think there's something insidious to that phenomenon, because in the alternative media, people like to think or believe, well, yes, the MSM propaganda media is going to cover the news this way. Well, we're going to show how they're lying or where they're wrong or where the agenda's gone. But it's still the fact that the MSM, the editors at, MSMBS, get to set the agenda that everyone's going to talk about by presenting the news. And sometimes there are spectacular events that one cannot avoid discussing. And for me, these are the events like 9/11 that clearly did change people's perception of the world and did enable a number of agenda items to move along. Of course, it didn't fundamentally, the world was on a certain path and all of that, but it was certainly the catalyst for a lot of different things. But I think people get so caught up in the day-to-day flow of the news that, again, is being picked for your consumption in some office, in by some editor at some MSM publication. People get so caught up in that they miss, I think, the bigger picture of what's happening. That's right. I have quite explicitly dealt with this subject before. And again, if all of this seems very familiar, it's because I do really, truly believe that narrative is incredibly important to our understanding of the world, the way we perceive the world, and then our perceptions bring and manifest different things into reality because our attention, our focus will be directed elsewhere. So yes, this is an important point and one I'm going to continue stressing over and over and over again because it is such a fundamental part of the way reality is constructed that we need to understand it. Not only because it can have an effect on whether or not we're paying attention to the World Economic Forum, but because once we understand the power of narrative, we can use this tool for ourselves. So, perhaps a way to reframe this for people who are sick of hearing about narrative, it's attention. The most important thing that we have is our attention, what we choose to focus on, especially when, for the most part, we are unaware that we have a choice, that we are making a choice to focus on this or that issue. And it is, make no mistake about it, it is a choice. And when we choose to focus on the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset, suddenly they're everywhere and they're all over the place and they're directing everything. And when we choose not to focus on the World Economic Forum, whatever happened to them? Where'd they go? So how can we use that principle for our own benefit? How can we direct our attention in order to create something that we actually want in the world, rather than simply to focus on the things that we don't want in the world? As you may or may not know, because I've talked about it several times now, that was explicitly the foundational, fundamental principle that I used to create Solutions Watch, which, as you may or may not know, is an evolution of the propaganda watch that I was doing for many years, where every single week, let's look at this piece of propaganda, let's dissect this piece of propaganda, let's find out how this piece of propaganda is working, let's look under the hood of this piece of propaganda so that we can examine it, understand the way the lies are working, the effect that they're having on people, and hopefully arm ourselves against it. That's a noble enough pursuit. But after several years of doing that, we get the picture. Yeah, I understand. This is propaganda. This is how it works. And so I specifically and consciously directed my attention away from looking at propaganda over and over and over and simply focusing on propaganda. How about if I direct my attention towards solutions? I wonder if I will be able to find a solution to talk about. And lo and behold, 3+ years later, Solutions Watch has had numerous editions on many, many, many different facets of things that we can be doing, ways we can be directing our time, energy, and attention that I posit are more productive and ultimately more helpful than simply focusing on the propaganda or on focusing on the World Economic Forum, etc. So, I think there is a genuine lesson to be learned from this seemingly innocent rhetorical question from Tyler Durden. Whatever happened to the WEF? Well, in one sense, nothing. They're still there, they're still doing their thing, but we are not paying attention to it. And maybe that's a good thing, but only if we can consciously direct our attention towards what we want to be focusing on. What is the news? Anyway, is the news about the latest protest in Kempau Square in remembrance of the 3rd anniversary of the Hormsburg massacre? Or is it something relevant to your life and what is happening in your community even? Hey, someone started a new community garden. Maybe that is more relevant news to your life than what happened halfway around the world today. Anyway, I do think that this is an incredibly important thing for us to be continuing to be aware of. It's all narrative, and it's all about where we are placing our attention, where we are directing our time, our energy, and our resources. So, on that note, I hope that that answers the question, whatever happened to the WEF? And as always, I would exhort you to go and take a look at the show notes for today's episode so that you can watch and peruse some of this material in greater depth. The links will be in the show notes as always, and as always, I'm looking forward to the commentary from the Corbett Report community. Corbett Report members are invited to log into the website and leave your comments in the discussion thread below. But that's going to do it for today. James Corbett, CorbettReport.com.